Hi guys. Today I want to introduce you to the novel Lord of the Flies by William Golding. We're going to be reading this book for the next few weeks, and I want to make sure that you're able to follow along and not get too confused. This is an adult book even though it's about kids. The main characters are British schoolboys who crash landed on a deserted island, and there are no grown-ups around, so they have to figure out how to survive on their own. Let's get into the first chapter. I'm going to read it out loud, and I want you to follow along. This is not a substitute for actually reading this book. I want you to put your eyes on the page too, because I know you're going to benefit from reading this yourselves. Here we go, chapter 1. This is called The Sound of the Shell. The boy with fair hair lowered himself down the last few feet of rock and began to pick his way toward the lagoon. Though he had taken off his school sweater and trailed it now from one hand, his gray shirt stuck to him and his hair was plastered to his forehead. All around him, the long scar smashed into the jungle was a bath of heat. He was clambering heavily among the creepers and broken trunks when a bird, a vision of red and yellow, flashed upwards with a witch-like cry, and this cry was echoed by another. "Hi," it said. "Wait a minute." Well, these kids are British, so I guess we could do it with a British accent. Or I'm going to try to do it with a British accent, so bear with me. "Hi," it said. "Wait a minute." I told you to bear with me. The undergrowth at the side of the scar was shaken and a multitude of raindrops fell pattering. "Wait a minute," the voice said. "I got caught up." The fair boy stopped and jerked his stockings with an automatic gesture that made the jungles seem for a moment like the home counties. The voice spoke again. "I can't hardly move with all these creeper things." The owner of the voice came backing out of the undergrowth so that twigs scratched on a greasy windbreaker. The naked crooks of his knees were plump, caught and scratched by thorns. He bent down, removed the thorns carefully, and turned around. He was shorter than the fair boy and very fat. He came forward, searching out safe lodgments for his feet, and then looked up through thick spectacles. "Where's the man with the megaphone?" The fair boy shook his head. "This is an island. At least I think it's an island. That's a reef out in the sea. Perhaps there aren't any grown-ups anywhere." The fat boy looked startled. "They was the pilot, but he wasn't in the passenger cabin. He was up in front." The fair boy was peering at the reef through screwed-up eyes. "All them other kids," the fat boy went on. "Some of them must have got out. They must have, mustn't they?" The fair boy began to pick his way casually as possible toward the water. He tried to be offhand and not too obviously uninterested, but the fat boy hurried after him. "Aren't there any grown-ups at all?" "I don't think so." The fair boy said this solemnly, but then the delight of realized ambition overcame him. In the middle of the scar, he stood on his head and grinned at the reversed fat boy. Whenever this young boy feels happy, he's going to stand on his head. Let's see how many times he stands on his head throughout the book. "No grown-ups!" The fat boy thought for a moment. "That pilot..." The fair boy allowed his feet to come down and sat on the steamy earth. "He must have flown off after he dropped us. He couldn't land here, not in a plane with wheels. We was attacked." "He'll be back all right." The fat boy shook his head. "When we was coming down, I looked through one of them windows. I saw the other part of the plane. There were flames coming out of it." He looked up and down the scar. "And this is what the cabin done." See, what happened is the plane crashed on this island and it tore up the ground. And everywhere where the ground is torn up, they're calling that the scar. The fair boy reached out and touched the jagged end of a trunk. For a moment he looked interested. "What happened to it?" he asked. "Where's it got to now?" "That storm dragged it out to sea. It wasn't half dangerous with all them tree trunks falling. They must have been some kids still in it." He hesitated for a moment, then spoke again. "What's your name?" "Ralph." The fat boy waited to be asked his name in turn, but this proffer of acquaintance was not made. The fair boy, called Ralph, smiled vaguely, stood up, and began to make his way once more toward the lagoon. The fat boy hung steadily at his shoulder. "I expect there's a lot more of us scattered about. You haven't seen any others, have you?" Ralph shook his head and increased his speed. Then he tripped over a branch and came down with a crash. The fat boy stood by him, breathing hard. "My auntie told me not to run," he explained, "on account of my asthma." "Asthma?" "That's right. I can't catch my breath. I was the only boy in our school had asthma." said the fat boy with a touch of pride. "And I've been wearing specs since I was 3. He took off his glasses and held them out to Ralph, blinking and smiling, and then started to wipe them against his grubby windbreaker. An expression of pain and inward concentration altered the pale contours of his face. He smeared the sweat from his cheeks and quickly adjusted the spectacles on his nose. "Them fruit." He glanced round the scar. "Them fruit. I expect..." He put on his glasses, waded away from Ralph, and crouched down among the tangled foliage. "I'll be out again in just a minute." See, what's happened here is that this fat boy has been eating fruit found on the island, and whether or not the fruit was too ripe or not ripe enough or whatever the case is, it's hurt his stomach. And now he's in there evacuating his bowels, for lack of a better phrase. Ralph disentangled himself cautiously and stole away through the branches. In a few seconds, the fat boy's grunts were behind him, and he was hurrying toward the screen that still lay between him and the lagoon. He climbed over a broken trunk and was out of the jungle. The shore was fledged with palm trees. These stood or leaned or reclined against the light, and their green feathers were 100 feet up in the air. The ground beneath them was a bank covered with coarse grass, torn everywhere by the upheavals of fallen trees, scattered with decaying coconuts and palm saplings. Behind this was the darkness of the forest proper, and the open space of the scar. Ralph stood, one hand against a gray trunk, and screwed up his eyes against the shimmering water. Out there, perhaps a mile away, the white surf flinked on a coral reef, and beyond that the open sea was dark blue. Within the irregular arc of coral, the lagoon was still as a mountain lake, blue of all shades and shadowy green and purple. The beach between the palm terrace and the water was a thin stick, endless apparently, for to Ralph's left the perspectives of palm and beach and water drew to a point at infinity, and always, almost visible, was the heat. And so you guys have all seen that before when it's the summertime and you're standing out on the street and you kind of look, and right above the surface of the street you can see that shimmering mirage of heat. That's what he's seeing on the beach, so it lets you know it's pretty hot where they are. He jumped down from the terrace. The sand was thick over his black shoes and the heat hit him. He became conscious of the weight of clothes, kicked his shoes off fiercely, and ripped off each stocking with its elastic garter in a single movement. Then he leaped back on the terrace, pulled off his shirt, and stood there among the skull-like coconuts with green shadows from the palms and the forest sliding over his skin. He undid the snake clasp of his belt, lugged off his shorts and pants, and stood there naked, looking at the dazzling beach and the water. It's important to note here that William Golding has started to add some imagery details, and he describes these coconuts as being skull-like. And he does that on purpose. It's not an accident. He wants you to think about that maybe this island isn't safe. And if you notice the way he describes this boy's belt, it's a snake clasp. And snakes are typically not associated with friendliness, especially if you're thinking of like the Garden of Eden or something. So you definitely get the sense that William Golding is hinting to his reader that things may not be as pleasant on this island as they seem right now. He was old enough, 12 years and a few months, to have lost the prominent tummy of childhood, and not yet old enough for adolescence to have made him awkward. You could see now that he might make a boxer as far as width and heaviness of shoulders went, but there was a mildness about his mouth and eyes that proclaimed no devil. He patted the palm trunk softly and forced at last to believe in the reality of the island, laughed delightedly again, and stood on his head. He turned neatly onto his feet, jumped down to the beach, knelt and swept a double armful of sand into a pile against his chest. Then he sat back and looked at the water with bright, excited eyes. So in this one paragraph, you really get a lot of information about Ralph's character. You learn that he is physically kind of a strong, maybe a strong kind of boy, maybe a boxer, they say, but then it references his mouth being kind of soft, and so you get the idea that he's not necessarily out to pick fights, but he could probably handle himself if he had to. Ralph, the fat boy, lowered himself over the terrace and sat down carefully, using the edge as a seat. "I'm sorry I've been such a time. Them fruit." He wiped his glasses and adjusted them on his button nose. The frame made a deep pink V on the bridge. He looked critically at Ralph's golden body and then down at his clothes. He laid a hand on the end of a zipper that extended down his chest. "My auntie." Then he opened the zipper with decision and pulled the whole windbreaker over his head. "There." Ralph looked at him sidelong and said nothing. "I expect we'll want to know all their names," said the fat boy, "and make a list. We ought to have a meeting." Ralph did not take the hint, so the fat boy was forced to continue. "I don't care what they call me," he said confidentially, "so long as they don't call me what they used to call me at school." Ralph was faintly interested. "What was that?" The fat boy glanced over his shoulder and then leaned toward Ralph. He whispered, "They used to call me Piggy." I lost my place. Yes, they used to call me Piggy. Ralph shrieked with laughter. He jumped up. "Piggy! Piggy! Ralph, please!" Piggy clasped his hands in apprehension. "I said I didn't want... Piggy! Piggy!" Ralph danced out into the hot air of the beach and then returned as a fighter plane with wings swept back and machine gun Piggy. Show! And that lets you know a little bit about what might have happened to their plane. That he's reenacting this show kind of machine gunning indicates that there's potential that their plane was gunned down by an enemy plane. He dived in the sand at Piggy's feet and lay there laughing. "Piggy!" Piggy grinned reluctantly, pleased despite himself at even this much recognition. "So long as you don't tell the others." Ralph giggled into the sand. The expression of pain and concentration returned to Piggy's face. "Half a sec." He hastened back into the forest. Ralph stood up and trotted along to the right. Here the beach was interrupted abruptly by the square motif of the landscape, a great platform of pink granite thrust up uncompromisingly through the forest and terrace and sand and lagoon to make a raised jetty 4 feet high. So what they have is kind of like a stage. The top of this was covered with a thin layer of soil and coarse grass and shaded with young palm trees. There was not enough soil for them to grow to any height, and when they reached perhaps 20 feet, they fell and dried, forming a crisscross pattern of trunks, very convenient to sit on. The palms that still stood made a green roof, covered on the underside with a quivering tangle of reflections from the lagoon. Ralph hauled himself onto this platform, noted the coolness and shade, shut one eye, and decided that the shadows on his body were really green. He picked his way to the seaward edge of the platform and stood looking down into the water. It was clear to the bottom and bright with the efflorescence of tropical weed and coral. A school of tiny glittering fish flickered hither and thither. Ralph spoke to himself, sounding the bass strings of delight. "Whiz-ho!" Beyond the platform there was more enchantment, some act of God, a typhoon perhaps, or the storm that had accompanied his own arrival had banked sand inside the lagoon so that there was a long, deep pool in the beach with a high ledge of pink granite at the further end. Ralph had been deceived before now by the specious appearance of depth in a beach pool, and he approached this one preparing to be disappointed. But the island ran true to form, and the incredible pool, which clearly was only invaded by the sea at high tide, was so deep at one end as to be dark green. Ralph inspected the whole 30 yards carefully and then plunged in. The water was warmer than his blood, and he might have been swimming in a huge bath. Piggy appeared again, sat on the rocky ledge, and watched Ralph's green and white body enviously. Piggy has had to go back to the bathroom in the trees, and now he's coming back. "You can't half swim!" "Piggy!" Piggy took off his shoes and socks, arranged them carefully on the ledge, and tested the water with one toe. This really gives you a really good indication of the kind of person that Piggy is. He's very cautious. He doesn't, want to take any kind of risks, even with, water that he sees somebody else swimming in. He's still concerned about the temperature.